For 2.5 centuries, one clan held Japan in its grip, from the frozen northern coastline of Hokkaido to the subtropical islands of Kyushu, from the bustling merchant houses of Osaka to the imperial court in Kyoto. The Tokugawa controlled it all. 15 shoguns, the supreme military rulers of Japan, sat at the head of the most stable feudal government the country had ever known. They commanded roughly 270 daimyo, or feudal lords, each bound by oath and law to serve the Tokugawa above all others. They controlled approximately 7 million koku of productive land, a koku being the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year, and in practical terms, that meant they held the economic engine of an entire civilization in their hands. Their capital, Edo, was not just the seat of power. By the 18th century, it was the largest city on the planet, home to more than 1 million people, surpassing London, surpassing Paris, surpassing Beijing. Samurai filled its streets, merchants crowded its markets, artisans built its temples, and along the castle walls, the Tokugawa hollyhock crest, 3 stylized leaves arranged in a circle, announced to every visitor exactly who owned this city and everything in it. The Tokugawa gave Japan something extraordinary. 265 years of unbroken peace. No foreign wars, no major civil conflicts, no large-scale invasions. In a world where European empires were bleeding each other dry through centuries of nearly constant warfare, Japan under the Tokugawa experienced something close to a miracle of stability. A sophisticated urban culture flourished. Literacy rates climbed to levels rivaling those of the most advanced nations in Europe. A network of roads, a postal system, a vibrant publishing industry, all of it grew under the long shadow of Tokugawa rule. And then, in the span of a single year, all of it was gone. The last shogun resigned. His army lost a war. His castle, the great fortress of Edo, was handed over to his enemies without a fight. His family's domains, those 7 million koku, were slashed to a fraction. His samurai, the warrior class that had served the Tokugawa for generations, were scattered, impoverished, and eventually erased as a social class altogether. But the story of what happened to the Tokugawa after their empire collapsed doesn't follow the script you might expect. This is not a tale of execution, like the Romanovs in Russia. It is not a story of permanent exile and starvation, like the Ottomans in Turkey. The Tokugawa story is something stranger, something more complicated, and in many ways something more remarkable. The last shogun became a photographer. A rebel admiral who fought to the bitter end became a government minister. Samurai warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle became tea farmers. And the dynasty itself, founded in 1603 by a warlord named Tokugawa Ieyasu, still exists today, led by a man who translates books for a living. This is the story of how a family that ruled a nation for 265 years lost everything, and then became something no one could have predicted. Tokugawa Yoshinobu never wanted the job. He was the 7th son of the Lord of Mito, one of the 3 great branch families of the Tokugawa clan, and he had been groomed for leadership from childhood, trained in martial arts, calligraphy, and political strategy by the finest scholars in the domain. But when the position of shogun finally fell to him in 1866, it came at the worst possible moment. Japan was cracking apart. For more than 200 years, the Tokugawa had kept Japan sealed off from the outside world, a policy known as sakoku, or closed country. Foreign ships were turned away. Trade was restricted to a handful of tightly controlled ports. Christianity was banned. The system had worked, more or less, for generations. But in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with a squadron of steam-powered warships, and the isolation was over. Perry demanded trade agreements. Other Western nations followed. The shogunate, built for a world that no longer existed, was forced to negotiate with powers it had spent centuries ignoring. By the time Yoshinobu became the 15th shogun, the damage was serious. Rival domains in Japan's southwest, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, had already begun plotting to overthrow the shogunate and restore direct rule to the emperor, a teenager named Meiji. Yoshinobu tried to reform. He modernized his military with help from French advisors. He restructured the government. He was intelligent, capable, and by most accounts, the most personally talented shogun in generations. It was not enough. On November 9, 1867, Yoshinobu did something no shogun had ever done. He resigned. He formally returned governing authority to the emperor, hoping that by giving up the title voluntarily, he could preserve the Tokugawa's influence within a new governing council of feudal lords. It was a calculated gamble, and it failed spectacularly. His rivals in Satsuma and Choshu had no interest in sharing power with the Tokugawa. They obtained an imperial edict, later shown to be a forgery, authorizing the use of force. On January 3, 1868, a palace coup in Kyoto declared the restoration of imperial rule. Yoshinobu was stripped of all titles and land. What followed was the Boshin War, a civil war that tore across Japan for over a year. The first major battle came at Toba Fushimi, just outside Kyoto, in late January 1868. Yoshinobu's forces outnumbered the imperial troops. By sheer numbers, he should have had the advantage. But when the imperial forces raised the chrysanthemum banner, the sacred symbol of the emperor himself, the calculus changed in an instant. Fighting against that banner meant fighting against the emperor. Yoshinobu made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He abandoned his army. In the middle of the battle, while his soldiers were still fighting and dying, the last shogun of Japan boarded a ship under cover of darkness and fled to Edo. His commanders were stunned. His soldiers felt betrayed. The Tokugawa forces, leaderless and demoralized, collapsed. Yoshinobu arrived in Edo not as a returning commander, but as a broken man. He went straight to the temple of Kaneiji in the Ueno district, and there, behind its walls, he placed himself under voluntary confinement. The most powerful man in Japan had made himself a prisoner. The imperial army marched east. Tens of thousands of soldiers, bearing the chrysanthemum banner, advanced toward Edo with orders to take the Tokugawa capital. If they had attacked, the destruction would have been staggering. Edo was a city of more than 1 million people, a dense, sprawling metropolis of wooden buildings, paper screens, and narrow streets. A military assault would have meant fire, and fire in Edo meant catastrophe. The city had burned before, and everyone knew what that looked like. One man decided it would not happen again. Katsukaishu, the shogunate's army minister, was a pragmatist, a reformer, and one of the few senior Tokugawa officials who understood that the war was already lost. He reached out to Saigo Takamori, the commanding general of the imperial forces, and proposed a deal. The Tokugawa would surrender Edo Castle, the fortress that had been the seat of shogunal power for over 250 years, without a fight. In exchange, the city would be spared, and Yoshinobu's life would be preserved. The negotiations happened in a modest house in the Mita district of Edo in early April 1868. Two men, sitting across from each other, decided the fate of a city and a dynasty. Saigo agreed to the terms. On April 11, 1868, Edo Castle was handed over to the imperial army. Not a single shot was fired. A city of more than 1 million people was saved. But the price was total submission. The Tokugawa's vast domains, those 7 million koku of land that had made them the most powerful family in Japan, were confiscated almost entirely. The new Meiji government allowed the clan to keep just 700,000 koku, centered on the province of Suruga, which became the new Shizuoka domain. In practical terms, the Tokugawa lost roughly 90% of everything they had controlled for 2.5 centuries. The 4-year-old boy who had been appointed as the new head of the Tokugawa clan, a child named Kaminosuke from the Taiyasu branch of the family, was sent to Shizuoka to govern this diminished territory. He would later take the name Tokugawa Iesato. He was too young to understand what had happened. The adults around him understood all too well. The greatest dynasty in Japanese history had been reduced to a provincial lordship, its castle surrendered, its capital renamed. On September 3, 1868, Edo was officially renamed Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital, and the teenage Emperor Meiji moved into the castle the Tokugawa had built. The building still stood. The family that built it had been sent away. Not everyone accepted defeat. While Yoshinobu submitted and Edo fell without bloodshed, a portion of the Tokugawa navy refused to surrender. Admiral Enomoto Takeaki, a brilliant naval commander trained in the Netherlands, gathered a fleet of 8 warships and 4 transport vessels, loaded them with loyal soldiers and officers, and sailed north from Tokyo Bay in October 1868. His destination was Ezo, the northernmost island of Japan, known today as Hokkaido. At the time, it was sparsely settled, far from the centers of power, and home mostly to the indigenous Ainu people. Enomoto's plan was audacious. He would establish an independent government on Ezo, a haven for displaced Tokugawa retainers, and petition the emperor for permission to develop the island in the Tokugawa name. He was not alone. French military officers who had been advising the shogunate, men like Captain Jules Brunet and André Cazeneuve, defied their own government's recall orders and joined Enomoto's expedition. By December 1868, the rebel fleet had captured Hakodate and the star-shaped fortress of Goryokaku, and Enomoto controlled the entire island. On January 27, 1869, the Republic of Ezo was proclaimed. It was, remarkably, the first government in Japanese history to hold an election. Granted, only samurai could vote, and it was done by open ballot, but it was an election nonetheless. Enomoto was chosen as Sosai, a title roughly equivalent to president. His treasury contained 180,000 gold ryo coins that he had retrieved from Osaka Castle after Yoshinobu's hurried departure. The republic lasted 5 months. In April 1869, the Meiji government dispatched 7,000 troops and a fleet to Hokkaido. The imperial forces advanced swiftly, and on June 26, 1869, Enomoto surrendered. He turned over the fortress of Goryokaku to the imperial commander, a Satsuma officer named Kuroda Kiyotaka. Kuroda, by all accounts, was impressed by Enomoto's dedication and his willingness to fight for a cause even after it was clearly lost. He reportedly interceded to spare Enomoto's life. The rebel admiral was sentenced to a brief imprisonment, freed in 1872, and then, in one of the most surprising turns in the entire Tokugawa saga, he accepted a post in the very government that had defeated him. Enomoto went on to become the Japanese ambassador to Russia and held several cabinet-level positions in the Meiji government. A man who had waged war against the new Japan became one of its most capable servants. The military drama of the Boshin War and the Republic of Ezo makes for dramatic storytelling, but the quieter tragedy that followed was, in many ways, far more devastating. It was the slow, grinding destruction of an entire social class. The Tokugawa system had not just been a government, it had been a way of life. For 265 years, the samurai had occupied the top of Japan's social hierarchy, a rigid caste system that placed warriors above farmers, farmers above artisans, and artisans above merchants. Samurai didn't just fight, they administered, they judged, they governed. Their identity was inseparable from their swords, their codes of honor, their hereditary stipends paid in rice. When the Tokugawa fell, thousands of these samurai, particularly the Hatamoto, the direct retainers of the shogun who numbered in the tens of thousands, were suddenly adrift. Many followed the Tokugawa to Shizuoka, where the clan's reduced domain offered, at least in theory, a place for them. In reality, the domain was far too small and far too poor to support the flood of displaced warriors who arrived. Many could not find adequate means to support themselves, and according to contemporary accounts, a large proportion of the retainers in Shizuoka slipped into genuine destitution. The bitterness ran deep. Former retainers who had spent their lives training for military command and administrative governance found themselves with no marketable skills in the emerging modern economy. Some were so bitter toward Yoshinobu, whom they blamed for the disaster, that they actively plotted his assassination. Yoshinobu knew it. He was so afraid of being killed by his own former retainers that he redesigned his sleeping quarters to confuse any potential assassin, changing the layout regularly so no one could predict where he would be at night. Then the Meiji government began dismantling the samurai class itself. In stages that grew increasingly severe, the new government stripped away everything that had defined the warrior caste. Hereditary stipends were first reduced, then converted to one-time cash payments, then eliminated. On March 28, 1876, the Meiji government issued the Heito Edict, the sword abolishment decree. Samurai were forbidden from carrying their swords in public. For a class whose identity had been bound to the blade for centuries, this was not just a policy change, it was an erasure. Some retainers found ways to adapt. In Shizuoka, displaced Tokugawa samurai turned to the land. On the Makinohara Plateau, former warriors who had never farmed a day in their lives began clearing brush, digging irrigation channels, and planting tea. It was backbreaking work for men who had been trained in calligraphy and swordsmanship, not agriculture, but it worked. Over time, Shizuoka became one of Japan's most important tea-producing regions, a position it holds to this day. The samurai who lost their swords found a new identity in tea leaves. Others were not so fortunate. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by the same Saigo Takamori who had negotiated the bloodless surrender of Edo, was the last stand of the old samurai order. Ironically, some former Aizu domain samurai, Tokugawa allies who had suffered terribly after the Boshin War, volunteered for the imperial army to fight against Saigo, the man who had defeated them 9 years earlier. The old loyalties had already begun to dissolve. And what of the man at the center of it all? After his flight from Toba Fushimi and his confinement at Kaneiji, Tokugawa Yoshinobu received an official amnesty from the Meiji government in 1869. He was not executed. He was not formally exiled. He was simply set aside, a relic of the old order permitted to live in quiet obscurity. He chose obscurity with what seemed like relief. Moving to Shizuoka, Yoshinobu turned his back entirely on politics and public life. For 30 years, from 1868 to 1897, he lived in near-total seclusion, rarely seeing visitors, never making political statements, and pouring his considerable intelligence into an almost comically varied collection of hobbies. He practiced oil painting. He studied archery, drawing a bow daily well into his 70s. He hunted. He cycled through the streets of Shizuoka, a former military dictator on a bicycle, largely unrecognized, and he became, of all things, a serious photographer, good enough to win second prize in an aristocratic photography competition. Imagine that for a moment. A man who once commanded armies and decided the fates of millions, spending his afternoons developing photographs in a quiet room in a provincial city, completely invisible to the nation he once ruled. In 1897, at the age of 60, Yoshinobu finally moved to Tokyo. The following year, he was warmly received by Emperor Meiji at the Imperial Palace, a building that had been Yoshinobu's own castle just 3 decades earlier. It was the first formal meeting between the last shogun and the emperor whose restoration had ended his rule. On June 3, 1902, Meiji granted Yoshinobu the rank of prince, the highest in the Kazoku peerage system, a European-style nobility that the Meiji government had created. He was also permitted to establish his own Tokugawa branch family. After 34 years in the wilderness, the last shogun had been welcomed back. Yoshinobu died on November 22, 1913, at the age of 76, outliving Emperor Meiji by 16 months. He had been shogun for barely a year, but his retirement lasted 45 years. In death, he made one final break with his predecessors. Every Tokugawa shogun before him had been buried according to Buddhist rites. Yoshinobu requested a Shinto burial. His grave at Yanaka Cemetery in Tokyo is a simple mound, not a grand mausoleum. Even in death, he chose to be different from the dynasty he had been born to lead. The story of the Tokugawa after the fall could have ended as a tale of pure diminishment, a great dynasty reduced to a provincial footnote, its last shogun fading into a quiet retirement. But one life would prove that the story was far from over. Tokugawa Ieyasu was 4 years old when the weight of the Tokugawa name was placed on his shoulders. Born in 1863 as Kaminosuke in the Taiyasu branch of the family, he was appointed the 16th head of the Tokugawa clan in June 1868, just months after the shogunate's collapse. He did not choose this role. It was chosen for him by the adults who were scrambling to save what remained. His upbringing was shaped by a woman with a grudge. Tensho-in, the widow of the 13th shogun Ieyasu, took personal charge of the boy's education. She had deep loyalty to the Tokugawa name, but she had no loyalty to Yoshinobu. She blamed him entirely for the clan's fall. According to accounts from the time, when the Meiji government forces had surrounded Edo, Tensho-in urged the court to preserve the Tokugawa house, but she made no plea whatsoever for Yoshinobu's safety. The boy she raised grew up absorbing this view. Ieyasu himself would later say, bluntly, that Yoshinobu had destroyed the Tokugawa house and that he, Ieyasu, had rebuilt it. The rebuilding began in Britain. In 1877, at the age of 14, Ieyasu was sent to Eton College, one of England's most elite schools. A child born into a fallen Japanese military dynasty was now being educated alongside the sons of British aristocrats. He studied there for 5 years before returning to Japan in 1882, called home by Tensho-in. In 1884, when the Meiji government reorganized Japan's nobility into a European-style peerage system called the Kazoku, Ieyasu was granted the title of prince, the highest rank available. From there, his rise was steady and remarkable. He joined the House of Peers, the upper chamber of Japan's new parliament, in 1890. In 1903, at the age of 40, he was elected president of the House of Peers, a position he would hold for 30 consecutive years. He became one of the most prominent public figures in Japan, a bridge between the old feudal aristocracy and the new parliamentary democracy. In 1914, after a scandal brought down the sitting prime minister, there was a strong movement to make Ieyasu the next leader of Japan. An imperial command was issued, inviting him to form a cabinet. He declined, saying he was not qualified. It was a shrewd decision. The political environment was volatile, public demand for elected cabinets was growing, and the prime minister who did take the job, Okuma Shigenobu, saw his government collapse under a corruption scandal. Ieyasu's ambitions extended far beyond Japan. In 1921, he headed the Japanese delegation to the Washington Naval Conference, one of the most important diplomatic events of the post-war era. His support for naval disarmament earned him both respect abroad and hostility from Japan's growing militarist factions. He became president of the Japanese Red Cross in 1928 and spent the next decade traveling the world at his own expense, building international relationships and promoting humanitarian causes. In 1934, during a world tour, Ieyasu met President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington, received an honorary doctorate from the University of Southern California, and delivered a radio address to the American public about the enduring friendship between the United States and Japan. He was, in effect, acting as Japan's unofficial ambassador of goodwill at a moment when the relationship between the two nations was beginning to fracture. Ieyasu died on June 5, 1940, at the age of 76. It was only after his death, historians have noted, that Japanese militants were able to push the country toward joining the Axis powers in World War II. Whether Ieyasu's diplomatic relationships could have prevented the catastrophe that followed is unknowable. What is known is that the boy who had been handed a ruined dynasty at the age of 4 had spent his entire adult life rebuilding its reputation, transforming the Tokugawa name from a symbol of feudal defeat into a byword for diplomatic service and public duty. Ieyasu's son, Tokugawa Ieyasu, inherited the clan headship and the title of prince in 1940. He had already built his own distinguished career. A graduate of Tokyo Imperial University's law school, Ieyasu had entered the diplomatic corps in 1909 and served in posts around the world, including consul general in Sydney, envoy to Canada, and, in a historical irony too perfect to ignore, Japanese ambassador to Turkey from 1937 to 1939, the very country that had expelled the Ottoman royal family just 13 years before the Tokugawa lost their own empire. In 1946, Ieyasu became the president of the House of Peers, the same institution his father had led for 3 decades. He would be its last president. On May 2, 1947, the new Constitution of Japan, drafted under American occupation, formally abolished the kazoku, the entire peerage system. 889 titled families lost their noble status in a single stroke. The Tokugawa were no longer princes. They were no longer nobility. They were, for the first time in nearly 400 years, ordinary Japanese citizens. The abolition was the final layer stripped away. First, they had lost the shogunate. Then, they had lost their domains. Then, the samurai class itself had been dissolved. Now, even the noble titles that the Meiji government had granted as a consolation were gone. Every institutional marker of their extraordinary history had been removed. Ieyasu died in 1963, and the headship passed to his grandson, Tsunenari Tokugawa, a man whose life illustrates the Tokugawa transformation better than perhaps any other. Tsunenari was born in 1940, the same year his grandfather Ieyasu died. His bloodlines were a map of modern Japanese history. His great-grandfather on one side was Matsudaira Katamori, the Lord of Ezo, one of the Tokugawa's most loyal allies during the Boshin War. His maternal great-grandfather was Ieyasu himself, and through another line, he was a great-grandson of Shimazu Tadayoshi, the last lord of Satsuma Domain, the very clan that had led the charge to overthrow the Tokugawa. The grandson of enemies had become one family. In Tsunenari's own bloodline, the Boshin War had been settled not by swords, but by marriage. Tsunenari did not become a diplomat or a politician. He became a businessman. He spent his career at Nippon Yusen, one of Japan's major shipping companies, retiring as a senior executive in June 2002. A descendant of shoguns, commuting on the Tokyo subway to a corporate office, building a career in commercial shipping. But retirement freed him to pursue a different kind of mission. In 2003, he established the Tokugawa Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the cultural treasures, documents, armor, and art that the Tokugawa family had accumulated over centuries, many of which had been lost or scattered during the Meiji Restoration and the American bombing campaigns of World War II. In 2007, he published a book called The Edo Inheritance, arguing that the 265 years of Tokugawa rule had not been the dark age that modern Japanese education often portrayed, but rather a period of remarkable peace, economic innovation, and cultural sophistication. It was, in a sense, a descendant's defense of his ancestors' legacy, written not from a throne, but from a retiree's desk. On January 1, 2023, Tokugawa Ieyasu became the 19th head of the Tokugawa Clan. It was the first succession in 60 years. Born in 1965 in Tokyo's Shibuya district, Ieyasu was educated at Keio University, earned a master's degree in economics from the University of Michigan, and studied at Columbia University. He speaks fluent English. He has worked for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. He translates books, including his father Tsunenari's The Edo Inheritance, from Japanese into English. In 2019, he ran for a seat in Japan's House of Councillors, the upper house of parliament, representing the Shizuoka district, the same territory his ancestors had been confined to after their fall. He ran as a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party and lost. The 19th head of the house that once ruled Japan is a translator, an author, and a cultural commentator. He does not command armies. He does not control domains. He does not sit in a castle. He leads the Tokugawa Memorial Foundation and appears occasionally on Japanese television to discuss history. The Tokugawa hollyhock crest, those 3 leaves that once meant absolute power over an entire nation, still draws visitors to the Toshogu Shrine at Nikko, where the dynasty's founder, Ieyasu, is enshrined. Edo Castle, the fortress the Tokugawa built and Yoshinobu surrendered, stands today as the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, home not to the shoguns but to the emperor whose ancestors reclaimed it in 1868. The tea plantations of Shizuoka's Makinohara Plateau, cleared and planted by desperate samurai retainers who had lost everything, produced some of the finest green tea in the world. 15 shoguns ruled from that castle over 265 years. 1 resigned, 1 fled a battle. 1 was 4 years old when he inherited a broken name. 1 studied at Eton and nearly became prime minister. 1 served as ambassador to the country that exiled the Ottomans. 1 worked at a shipping company and wrote a book. 1 translates for a living. The Tokugawa were not executed, like the Romanovs. They were not exiled and left to starve, like the Ottomans. They were not humiliated into puppet rule, like the last emperors of China. They were punished, diminished, stripped of titles, stripped of territory, stripped of their swords. And then, generation by generation, they adapted. They sent their children to Eton. They joined the government that defeated them. They planted tea. They wrote books. They became citizens. There is something in that story that speaks to a question bigger than any single dynasty. What survives the death of power? Not castles, because the castles get handed to someone else. Not titles, because constitutions can erase those with a single vote. Not territory, because borders are redrawn by the victors. What survives is the willingness to become something new. The Tokugawa understood this, perhaps not at first, perhaps not willingly, but eventually and completely. They did not cling to the shogunate. They did not spend a century in exile demanding restoration. They let go of what they had been, and they became what the world required them to be. The house that Ieyasu built in 1603 still stands, 4 centuries later. It is not a palace anymore. It is a name, a foundation, a set of translated books, a crest on a shrine gate, and as of January 2023, it has a new head, the 19th in an unbroken line. The story, 400 years in, is still being written. If this story surprised you, do me a favor, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these deep dives into the histories that shaped our world. Drop a comment and let me know what you think defines a dynasty, its power, or its ability to outlast that power. Until next time, take care of yourselves.